morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to do a quick introduction of the names of the people here. They will introduce themselves in a few minutes, but moving directly down the line, Vicky Sato, who is the chairman of Biotechnology and chairman of Denali Therapeutics. Joel Ettenberg at BlueRock Therapeutics, the CEO there. Terry McGuire, who is the founding partner of Polaris Partners. Dr. Philip Sharp, who is at the Institute of, an institute professor and professor of biology at MIT. And then behind us here is Joel Marcus, who is the executive chairman and founder of Alexandria. And each of them will give you a sense of their, what they're doing and their focus. So this is a particularly interesting moment to talk about the Boston area, the Cambridge area in terms of life sciences, the scientific community's breakthrough work in biopharmaceuticals, and then particularly in gene and cell therapy. The panel includes experts and leaders in scientific discovery and drug innovation, investment in and development of a series of breakthrough scientific and technology startups, the interest and investment in large pharma companies, what's the interest in this community, and do we have dominance still specifically? And then a focus on actually creating physical space and atmosphere here that has encouraged collaboration and discovery. So each of our distinguished panelists will speak to that, and then literally about this geographic region. And I guess I'd like to say just this is the reason this is such an interesting moment is the backdrop is obvious, but I'll just say it anyway. And it's we find ourselves in a rather chaotic moment. Markets are volatile. We're experiencing inflation. There's talk of recession. There's certainly talk of recession in Europe. The war between Russia and Ukraine has fully engaged the NATO countries, but there's concern about where is China and India in that equation. Supply chains are disrupted. Fossil fuels are trading at higher multiples. And meanwhile, we have just experienced maybe in spite of or because of the pandemic, a large group of IPOs in biotech generally and in gene cell therapy. So what does that portend for the future? I mean, is that over? Where are we at in the cycle? So I'm going to turn to Terry, if I may, with your experience as a successful and well-known venture capitalist in the fields of life sciences generally and information technology more generally. What part of the cycle are we in generally, but also in gene and cell therapy, and what is the money chasing now?
Yeah, it's a great question and very relevant to the current moment. I think it's fair to say that this is an inflection point for the markets. We've enjoyed essentially a bull market for the better part of 10 years, and now we've seen that go away. I was thinking back when Ann first asked me this question, which is I started my venture capital career in '85 in Chicago, and I remember in October of '87 walking down the street and watching the stock tickers reflect Black Monday. And saw a massive decline in the marketplace at that moment. And then we lived through the 90s when biotech had its good days and its bad days, with the Great Recession, essentially a period after the boom, 2000, 2010, where biotechnologies were hard to find, fund, and then we grew from there. And so when I reflect on the moment, we were definitely going into a down period, but not a bad period in some sense. I think a down period essentially causes people to focus their businesses, essentially support the right teams. I think capital is available for those companies, but it becomes more challenging for other companies. And then what you see is investors, well, some investors have been coming into the market that are committed to the marketplace, that have been here for quite some time, will remain committed to the marketplace, and others will wander out. We'll see the crossover investors essentially leave the private investment and simply focus on public entities right now. So there's definitely going to be a shift in the marketplace. But again, I want to sort of say I think it's fundamentally good. There's a lot of pressure on the system. It makes it harder to raise capital. It makes us be focused. But I come back to the most fundamental issue, which is, are we creating value? Will the system enjoy its value? And I think the answer is yes. And so in the long haul, as we saw with essentially over the last 30 years, in the long haul, our sector will continue to get funded. It'll be harder for platform companies to get funded. It'll be more short-term focus on more immediate commercial opportunities, but I think there's a huge opportunity. It's really just based on the fact that what we're doing is so important and can ultimately be translated into important products. So I'm long-term optimistic, short-term a little bit pessimistic, although again, I don't think it's ultimately a bad thing. And my biggest fear is not that we go through a couple-year cycle, but we go through the lost decade, which was from 2000 to 2010, when essentially life science funding was fundamentally hard to do. But again, I think great companies came out of that period, and I expect great companies to come out of this period as well.
So just to repeat, we're not in 2001 or 2008. We're not repeating that.
Only time will tell whether we repeat. We had this wonderful conversation, and I'm looking at Joel now. Joel reminded us that each of these cycles has its own cause. And so this cause is Anne reflected on, we have a war in Ukraine, we have inflation taking place. But I think we had this long bull market in biotechnology, which ultimately had to give way because things go in cycles. So I don't believe it's going to be another 2001 to 2008 period, but you never know.
Well, on that optimistic note, we'll go to...
By the way, fundamentally, I want to say something. I'm incredibly optimistic. I just think when you go through these periods where there's a bull market that runs for so long, people get used to it. They think it's the norm. In fact, it isn't the norm. It's hard to grow companies. It's hard to raise capital. So I'm completely optimistic about the sector. I just think it's going to be more strenuous. It's going to be harder in the short run.
Right, and you've indicated the fundamentals are good.
Yeah.
Dr. Philip Sharp. So Phil, it's your early work in molecular biology, gene therapy associated with cancer in the 80s and in the 90s that not only earned you a Nobel Prize for physiology and medicine, but you arguably opened the door to the breakthroughs we are experiencing in the next 3 decades. So can we still claim that we are the leaders here in terms of gene and cell therapy? Is it a legitimate differentiator for us, and what does the future portend?
I think New England has been and will remain to be a very potent leader in biotech, gene and cell therapy in general. In 1978, Biogen was established here. It was almost a nascent new industry in this area, and it has been supported and grown. And as you may know, the CEO of Biogen resigned today, and there's an open search. And then in 2002, in the middle of the period that Terry was talking about as a difficult time for biotech, Anonym was established. And that's an RNAi company is doing quite innovative work. You look at what's happened over the last few years. RNA therapy has exploded. We have vaccines. We have an enormous amount of technology around CRISPR and gene therapy. Cell therapy is growing. So there's lots of innovation in this area. And even more importantly, there's lots of collaboration. There is a large community of physicians and hospitals and the medical schools. There's an enormous number of scientists and engineers that are all now familiar with biotechnology, the process of translating discoveries into innovations that benefit patients. So we're fundamentally strong. We're culturally strong. And I'm very confident that after whatever happens, there will be a very strong innovation community here in healthcare, biotech, and pharmaceuticals. And last week, I was participating in a conference where Mass General Brigham and MIT are agreeing to expand their AI and machine learning collaboration and data exchange. This collaboration, this culture of working together to solve problems is really fundamentally at the heart of it, New England's sweet spot. So I think we're in a strong position to continue to innovate and retain this industry in New England.
Thank you, Phil. I'm going to switch it up a little bit, Vicki and Joel, and go to Joel next, because Dr. Sharp has just talked about the innovation and the collaboration that is so prevalent here in the Boston area. So Joel Marcus is here joining us remotely. So first, welcome, Joel. You are credited with pioneering the idea of developing innovation clusters and campuses. So the physical real estate that has allowed for this kind of collaboration. And while your mandate is broad, and you have set these up in San Francisco, the Research Triangle, in New York, Seattle, and other places, hopefully you have a special place in your heart for the greater Boston area. And a brief conversation we had last week, you talked about 4 elements that differentiate this area from others. So if I could, I'd just like to name them: location, scientific talent and expertise, the amount of scientific talent and expertise we have, the science and technology that's been developed here, so speaking back to what Phil just mentioned, and then the abundance of capital available. Maybe there's a little less of it at the moment, but it's patient, and we certainly have lots of private equity and venture capital here in this community. So with that, Joel, I'll just ask you, is this still the place, and can you speak to those 4 elements?
Sure, and thank you, and it's good to see everybody. So when we started our company back in 1994 as a garage startup, we theorized that there were 4 elements that would make a cluster. If you remember Michael Porter's theory on clusterization, we kind of used that, but then built for biotech 4 critical elements that, and you just mentioned, location, talent, science, technology, and risk capital. And so we started as literally a garage startup, and I remember the early days. We actually helped start Anonym in their first outside the academic setting. Phil may remember in the early days of 2002 in our science hotel in West Cambridge. And today we own and operate and have in our pipeline about 16 million square feet in the Boston area. So I think picking up on what Terry said, if you just look at the environment today, Boston is clearly the dominant cluster worldwide for life science. I think everybody believes that Boston has the location to where. We operate campuses at Tech Square, One Kendall Square, and along the Binney Street corridor, together with Watertown and Fenway and Route 128. So location is a given, and obviously MIT has been the critical anchor, Harvard less so, in the sense that I think Harvard for many years was not so focused on translational work, but now certainly they are. But I think MIT is certainly the gold standard when it comes to that. When you get to risk capital, I think the things that Terry mentioned are important. The last bull market that just ended last year in biotech ran 9 years, longer than the previous cycles by a bit of a wide margin, and also attracted about 5 times as much capital as typically came into the sector during previous bull market runs. So what does that mean? That means excess. So too much capital chasing, too many projects focused on maybe too many opportunities. And I think that's one of the reasons that we've seen a huge adjustment in market caps, certainly for the public side, and we're starting to see that fall off onto the private side for sure. And a good example is there are probably 1,800 gene therapy medicines in clinical trials today. It's hard to imagine the government and payers paying for all of those. So that's something that we'll have to reckon with as the days come forward. I think when it comes to talent, and Phil is probably the poster person for that, this area the greater Boston area has been really the deepest talent pool of any place on the planet, and I think that continues. And there is today a war for talent, which I think we're seeing, and that's why so many new companies have started and continue to thrive in the greater Boston area. And then I think we mentioned risk capital, which is a little bit of what we just talked about. So as I kind of think about it, and then management teams, I mean, Terry's one of the really leading venture capitalists over many years who've really spotted and put together some of the most important management teams there have been. And so I think I'm very bullish for the greater Boston area, but I think we're in a new storm arena with this downturn that we have never really seen before. 2000, 2001 was different. It was the tech bubble. 08 and 09 was financial institution collapse, so pretty different. This has many factors, and I think there is no real playbook here other than for companies to conserve cash and focus on near-term product opportunities really is the best way to create value. And a differentiated high unmet medical need is what's going to take, I think the bar is going to continue to get higher. And as you see, more and more political people focus on this industry. I think COVID, in a sense, saved the reputation of the industry in many ways. It used to be under Roy Vagelos, the top CEO, and Merck was the, top company year after year. But we haven't seen those days for many years, so we'd like to restore the glory of this really super innovative industry.
Thank you, Joel. And we'll return to both Terry and Joel with some other questions relative to that. Let me turn to Vicky Sato. For those of you who don't know her, she has had enormous success, not only as a board chairman, as an executive, as a researcher, in many of the life sciences and biotech in this community. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Vertex's development and distribution of 2 breakthrough drugs in the treatment of cystic fibrosis that certainly generated global applause and acclaim. But you serve on the Presidential Council of Advisors in Science and Technology. Can you tell us about the focus of that work, 1, and 2, concerns and sort of relative to what we've been talking about here this morning around the research dollars that we have out of the US. We obviously get more than our fair share of NIH dollars in this area, and the kind of threat that China may be posing for us.
Thank you, Ann. So for those of you that don't know, the President's Council of Advisors in Science and Technology is charged with advising the President, the White House more broadly, on how science and technology can support the continued development of the United States. Not surprisingly, this administration is extremely committed to the importance of science, and you can all read on the website of PCAST, as we call it, the open letter that President Biden wrote asking us to focus on 5 specific areas. Again, not surprisingly, those include broadly writ public health, so that we can be better prepared for the next, God forbid, pandemic, so that we can develop a public health system that more effectively serves the broad demographic of this country. We've heard way too much about the shortfalls of the system as it exists today. How science and technology can address the extreme weather conditions that climate change is imposing on us, and what are the scientific things that we could be doing more effectively and better. And then certainly, to Ann's last point, how do we protect American competitiveness in science and technology? So the mandate is broad, it's important, it's exciting. The committee, which consists of about 25 people across the landscape of science and technology, is hard at work on analyzing and addressing these problems. With regard to competitiveness, particularly in the biotech sphere, which is what we're focused on here, I think for the last 50, 70 years, The United States has been unchallenged with regard to our dominance in biomedical research and in the application of the insights of basic biological and biochemical science to addressing problems of health. For the first time in this, I think for the first time we are seeing a significant international challenge, primarily from China. And the rate at which China has been able to move into areas of really important cutting-edge biotechnology is impressive. I remember, having been around for a long time, I remember the first inklings of this. I remember visiting China with a group of students from HBS and seeing a couple things. One was that it all seemed fairly basic, and the other was feeling the intense commitment that the country had to really seeing investment in this area as an important driver. And now we're seeing the first drugs coming from these companies looking for approval in Western markets. So I think the mission has expanded. This is the appearance of a different kind of competitive threat. And I think that the importance of continued and enhanced investment across the pipeline, from enhanced investment in basic research through enhanced investment in the translational research that drives economic value, is going to be critically important. It's a challenging time, and given all of the other challenges we're facing as a nation, it's important to keep the focus here. Boston, people look to Boston, as Joel has said, people look to Boston as an exemplar of the kinds of components that need to come together to create both innovation, as Phil Sharp has talked about, but also the economic drivers that Terry and Joel have been talking about. So we're leaders here. We need to protect that leadership. We need to fight for continued funding, and we need to continue to invest in the infrastructure that makes products possible.
Thank you. You mentioned everyone has talked about the life sciences and gene and cell therapy and our leadership here, but you've just mentioned that much of the focus, or part of the focus, is on the science and technology needed around research on climate change. Is this a community that can lay claim to leadership there, or is that being divined by another part of the country? Joel, maybe I'll ask you that question.
Well, that is spread throughout the United States. I think we see pockets of it really on the East Coast and the West Coast. We did a press release, I think, in January, where we announced we had committed last year over $100 million to climate change technologies. And I think it's pretty indispensable. If you look at most investors today, people are focused on core life science. The agri-food tech area is one that has boomed and become, I think the numbers are probably off the charts compared to almost any other industry, given the increase in venture capital since 2016. It's been up just an enormous, almost like a skyrocket. And climate change technologies are now attracting large pools of capital. And most of the venture funds, whether it be funds like Terry's or certainly Flagship that is anchored there in the greater Boston area, have addressed each of those, both life science clearly, agri-food tech, and then climate. So I think it's become part of a basket of technologies that become core to the entire health of the planet. It's health, nutrition, and then obviously fighting climate change.
Thank you. And Terry, just can you follow up on that? Is there any money chasing the Boston area and the climate change area?
Absolutely. I mean, I think if you look at the great universities here, MIT and Harvard, BU, et cetera, I mean, they all have programs. And so we've had a portfolio of companies which we've backed that are broadly in the clean tech space, the environmental space, and in the ag space. And as Joel said, it's been a remarkable portfolio, and they've done well. So we've sort of approached it, which is there's a set of tools which you are all developing that are applicable not simply to human health, but to a broader set of social problems. And let's back them, let's find a social model or an investment model to support them. So yeah, if you look at our portfolio, we definitely have them in our portfolio.
Thanks. So in a minute, we're going to get back to startups and where we are in the cycle and where's the money. But Let me now turn to Seth Ettenberg. I want to just ask you, Seth, as a CEO and the Chief Science Officer before that, you have been with more than one well-established gene therapy and pharma company. You've also been with a startup, and this whole time you've been in Cambridge. But, so you've certainly lived the cycles, and we've been talking about, and you have experienced the lens from both startup to big pharma. What's the attraction to the Boston area for big pharma? Is it still the attraction? Are we the place to come? Is it a fight for talent? Tell us about where you are with BlueRock Therapeutics, owned by Bayer, and do you feel you have an advantage over startups because of at least a consistent bottom line, or at least big capital behind you?
Yeah, thanks. And advantages, I don't know if that's the word I would use versus there are various models in Cambridge and an ecosystem, and BlueRock, by the benefit of being wholly owned by Bayer, is a unique element in that ecosystem. And so we all spoke of the cycles that we're going through, and in fact, one of the things that we haven't been commenting on or slightly commented on is how the science, the breakthroughs that lead to the opportunities that we're going through, such as the Human Genome Project in the late 90s that led to lots of genomics companies and now targeted therapies that are the benefit for decades afterwards. And then we spoke earlier, Phil spoke earlier of RNAi, and cell and gene is playing a role in that. And I think the time and what allows maybe the personal part of the story from the talent coming into this area is the opportunity. And it's allowed for I feel like the byproduct somewhat of some of the panelists here that have created this environment or helped to create this environment, that our ability to come in to educate and learn on brand new technologies that don't exist yet, help be a part of that creation and that education to get them through to both clinical trial and then even further on into marketplace, happens here, and it's an experiment, and many of those experiments fail for good reasons and some not so good reasons. And I think it's that allows for people to come in and use their livelihood and their career to move the field forward. And I think it's a critical element of this environment, and I think that it's not changing. Through these cycles, the amazing part is having come out into biotech during 2 different boom cycles and then coming back in through pharma, it allows us to keep making progress. That each of these models plays a different role in the ecosystem here. And I think the one that's being created that we're in BlueRock right now is quite unique, and is really exciting and gives us a chance to be hiring and growing and advancing technology even through some of these downturns.
So just as a question to all of you, all but Phil are focused on finding talent and then putting them to work for your companies. Dr. Sharp is, of course, trying to find talent too, but he's growing them, so to speak, for the rest of us. So clearly there's not enough talent given these opportunities, or one would assume that just based on this conversation today. Dr. Sharp, where do you see the pipeline for the students? Is it, I mean, always we have had, if I may, fewer people of color, fewer women in this industry. What is the university system? How are you addressing that?
Well, there is a shortage of talent in this industry, and we at MIT and Harvard, and I speak as a faculty member of them, not as a leader, have for years tried to expand the population that would be attracted to a STEM-type education at MIT. For example, MIT as undergrads is 50% women. When I came to MIT 30, 40 years ago, it was about 25 to 30% women. The population in terms of minorities are expanding across the country. Yes, we can do a lot more, and we will continue to work on that. But generally, the New England area is a resource for the country in terms of education. We have outstanding educational institutes here, all the way from our state system to our privates. It's just an extraordinary place. And, you know, population growth has not happened here, more population growth in the South, but students want to come to this area to be educated. And many of them are attracted to life science and life science problems. And we're now at MIT, over a third of the engineers at MIT are working in life science. So it's a growing, attractive opportunity for students. And this area benefits from it.
Yesterday, Maria Zuber is the a vice president at MIT and, full disclosure, on the board of Bank of America, spoke about one of the issues around the dearth of talent is just sort of the educational grounding of STEM at a much earlier point. So I think that we'd all agree that we need to put more into that educationally. I hope that's part of the council's concerns, just getting enough students into this. Is that part of what you're thinking about, Vicki?
Very much. You know, I think workforce development across life sciences as well as physical sciences is incredibly important. And although we've had very aggressive programs to try and enhance the attraction of younger people to this area, I think we're learning we don't do it soon enough. And the success has been more muted than I think we might all have hoped with regard to the continued growth and expansion of careerists in science and technology across the national demographic. So this kind of workforce development education is hugely important, and I'm sure Maria, who is co-chair of PCAST, talked a lot about that. We could do much better, we should do much better. And as we talk about the importance of moving the economic power of science and technology-based industries across the country, it's going to be particularly important to make sure that the educational institutions in these areas are equipped to continue to create and feed the national need. It's not something that, you know, we can't sit here as a hub in Boston and send tens of thousands of scientists out to the country. It's not the most efficient thing to do, and it's not the most effective thing to do. So this kind of spread of educational quality and of doing a better job of really attracting young people to this field is going to be pretty essential.
You know,
Yeah, so Ann, I'd love to comment on that because I think the issue you raise is talked about everywhere, but frankly, I think it's the government's gigantic failure to embrace the things that need to be done. You talked about more women and minorities in science and technology. You know, one could imagine that if we had a sensible immigration policy, we could continue to attract great people from all over the world. I know a number of people who have great science backgrounds we're working with, trying to get them into this country the legal way, and they simply can't get in an efficient and timely manner. And then we partnered, for example, with, it's not a Boston group, but Duke University and Coach K at a foundation named after his mother called the Emily K Foundation, which to me is a great model. You've got to attack the educational efforts, as Vicki related to or talked about, at the very earliest stage. And what that program has done is taking kids from the Durham City schools, heavily minority populated, and putting them through a journey, an afternoon or an after-school journey that makes up of teaching, supplementing classroom education, teaching character and leadership development, which we can't forget, and also preparation for colleges. And over the last decade, we've been successful in getting more than 1,200 kids 100% acceptance into four-year colleges. Imagine if there was one of those in every school district or every city in this country, what our workforce might be like for the future. So we have the capacity to do it, but government seems incapable of doing it.
Well, I'll leave the politics aside, but we take your point about the need.
There's no politics, it's simply the failure of the politicians, right or left.
Okay. Okay, little lightning round here, if I may. In the meantime, if you're a mature company in biotech, life sciences, or even cell and gene therapy more specifically, if you are, you're through your IPO and you're in a later stage, even in a down moment, you've got manufacturing that can help you in the marketplace. Perhaps you have established partnerships, maybe royalties, even real estate as an asset. But if you're at an earlier stage, there's no doubt this is a difficult moment, or a more challenging moment, shall we say. So yesterday, and speaking to Adam Koppel, who some of you may know, he runs Bain Capital's life sciences practice. He suggested that gene and cell therapy can be more challenging because it's a slower process. And just to be a little provocative, just talking about that relative to the life sciences, it's the translation of the science into the first human and then the first clinical trials, the regulatory approvals, manufacturing, launch, global distribution, all the things that you all know about. But I wondered if you think that the runway for gene and cell therapy, because it can be longer, is just going to be more challenging in terms of attracting money in this time period. So who amongst you would like to take that on? I don't want to presume.
Maybe I can make a comment.
Okay.
I think the history of biotechnology is faced with this question every time a new platform comes along. It always seems daunting, technically impossible, difficult to translate, not enough talent around it, a lot of capital to build a physical plant, et cetera. So I think one has to balance that against the opportunity set, and I think cell and gene therapy have enormous opportunities. And so I, in my heart, believe there will be capital there for the best ideas. It'll be hard, there'll be a lot of swapping, there'll be trading with partners. Again, remember our ecosystem isn't just capital writing into companies. We have partnerships with people like Joel, we have partnerships with Seth's whole company. I mean, there's a bunch of partnerships that we can form as well. And so I think when the will is there and the opportunity set is there and the potential is there, I think we will find a way to fund it. And then I think what fundamentally happens is it becomes easier and more efficient, and next thing you know, 10 years from now, it's a lot more efficient. So I believe the capital is there. It's going to be hard, but at the end of the day, it's all based on value created, and the value in this area is just enormous. So there will be capital.
Maybe I can add as well, and I think actually these create times of opportunity for the industry. We're incredibly creative when it comes to drug development, and should be so when it comes to capital efficient use and partnerships. I think as we go through periods like this, as Terry just mentioned, some of those, the vehicles and or the methods by which we go about creation will need to adapt. And I think these periods actually force the ecosystem, force us to make those hard choices, and they're important as well.
Others?
I have a question.
I would just say this. Anonym started in 2002. It was in that period that you've heard described as a recession for about 8 years after it started. But there was a really exciting scientific breakthrough behind it. That was RNAi. But relative to this community, we had, as Joel commented, temporary space to move into. We were able to attract some of the best talent in the area because it was a new opportunity. John Maganori, who became CEO of the company, joined the company. We had relationships with Novartis, with Merck, with Roche. We raised capital ultimately on an IPO in a week's time. Ultimately, 18 years later, we get approval for the first product. In the next 2 years, we get approval for 2 more products, probably 3 products, and the science is now seen as a breakthrough for treatment of patients. We raised over $2 billion to make that happen over 18 years. That's investment in new technology that will change the pharmaceutical treatment of patients forever. So it is a really substantial community we have here, and it really can make a difference in people's lives.
Anne, could I ask a question?
Sure.
Could I ask a question of my distinguished colleagues here? Because it's something I've been thinking about. You know, as I mentioned before, I've been around for a long time, and I remember when antibodies were the new modality, and a company called Centocor that doesn't exist anymore raised a lot of money, and then their first antibody didn't work as well as people expected, and so the market crashed and so forth and so on. And now, of course, monoclonal antibodies represent some of the most important therapies that treat really broad-based diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, right? These are not niche markets, these are big markets. As I look at gene and cell therapy, the question that is in my mind, and I'm trying to learn a lot about it, but you all know more about it than I do. To Anne's point, are gene and cell therapies like that? Are we going to, because of their tremendous efficacy when they work, does that represent the opportunity to really see transformative cures and cares? Or is it going to be, because of its complexity, like bone marrow transplantation? Bone marrow transplantation is fantastically successful, as I'm sure some of you in the audience have fathomed, curative, but the complexity of the process has made it not the purview of companies, but the purviews of hospitals. And hospitals develop competitive reputation and income based on their skill in this. So I'm kind of at the crossroads of going, I don't know, gene and cell therapy, are we going to be incredibly effective in smaller areas, or are there going to be big companies that that are involved in this? So where do you?
The analogy is direct, I think, for you, Vicki, and for us, which is I remember when in the early days of biologics, to create a hybridoma, the fusion between a mouse cell and a human cell, there was like 5 guys across the country that just knew how to do it and do it and do it.
Yeah.
And now it's industrialized, and we have giant vats and/or single-use production. We're going to head the same way with cell and gene therapy. You heard yesterday the bespoke model of using AAVs and creating master drug files. We're headed that same way in gene therapy, and certainly cell therapy. It's many different cells across many different, and so it's not just a hybridoma, but we will get to that same place where it's a frozen product that and/or a lyophilized that a hospital can just give to a patient and be a one-time treatment. And so there is absolutely, at least in my vision, that future for us.
That's great.